This is Judaism Unbound, episode 509, Embracing Exile. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we're exploring a topic that's sparked a lot of curiosity among our listeners over the years, which is the question of how diaspora, or exile, relates to what Judaism has been, what it is today, and what it might be in the future. When people talk about Judaism as a diasporic religion, what do they mean? And today we're excited to be speaking with the person who literally wrote the book on this topic. Our guest today is David Kraemer, professor of Talmud at the Jewish Theological Seminary and author of a new book entitled Embracing Exile, The Case for Jewish Diaspora, which is a grand tour through the Jewish textual tradition, exploring the ways that Judaism has not always lamented being in diaspora and has often celebrated it. One more note about our guest today, David Kraemer, our very first ever guest, B'nai Lappi, who's joined us many times and was just back with us a few weeks ago. She cites David Kraemer as one of her primary teachers, who unlocked for her what the rabbis were really doing on every page in the Talmud. In a certain way, David Kraemer is a major influence on what Judaism Unbound has been, is, and will become, even though this is his first time on the show. And now here's a bit more background on David Kraemer. David Kraemer is the Joseph J. and Dora Abel Librarian and Professor of Talmud and Rabbinics at the Jewish Theological Seminary. His focus as a professor is on the literary analysis of rabbinic literature, rabbinic ritual, and Jewish diaspora ideologies. David Kraemer began teaching at JTS as a graduate student in 1980 and received his PhD in 1984. He accepted the position of librarian at the Jewish Theological Seminary in 2004 and has since played a crucial role in forging policy and expanding the impact of the library's world-renowned collections and programs. In addition to the book Embracing Exile, David Kraemer has written many other books, including A History of the Talmud, Reading the Rabbis, the Talmud as Literature, and The Mind of the Talmud, as well as a fascinating book called Jewish Eating and Identity Through the Ages. David Kraemer has written influential articles on the biblical books of Ezra and Nehemiah, the Mishnah, and other subjects, and also a commentary on Paul's letter to the Ephesians. In a work near and dear to our hearts, given our commitment to digital Judaism, David Kraemer also has the distinction of being the creator of the world's first ever Passover Haggadah app in 2012, which was designed specifically for interactive use via iPad at Passover Seders. So, David Kraemer, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Pleased to be here.
Well, it's interesting to talk to a Talmud scholar who has written a book. Of course, many books have been written about the Talmud, but I think of the Talmud as fundamentally an oral thing that was one day put down into book form. So before we talk too much about the book that you've written, I'm curious about the larger project that led to the book. What have you been working on over the last, many decades that led ultimately to this book?
What led to this book was Jewish life in the latter half of the 20th and into the 21st century. It's been impossible for caring Jews to live in this world, the world of this period, and not to be engaged with Israel and questions of Israel. From a time when I experienced a great romantic connection to Israel. I would say that my intimate connection to Israel began when I was a junior in university. I spent the year at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and I had the absolutely incredible experience of living in the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem at the time. But of course, when you have a deep romantic attachment, reality comes in. The reality went in a variety of directions, but one was that I was living in diaspora, and the priority given to Israel and the Jewish experience in the land of Israel, as the story was told, began for me to strike up against both contemporary and historical realities. Contemporary, because I and many, many Jews are living in diaspora and we're not going to be going anywhere. We were not going to move to the land of Israel. And secondly, much of what I was learning about the Jewish experience relating to Israel and exile it was clear to me was at best oversimplified and often just simply misrepresentative of the facts. And as I began to explore that, it became clear that I needed not only to explore it, but to teach it. And I taught it more and more over the years. And finally, based upon my teaching experience, to write it. And that's what led to this book.
It's interesting when you describe that because I think about some of the motivations that I had a decade ago or so when I was working in this world that's often called the world of Jewish innovation. And I felt that it was not thick enough, that it wasn't respected enough. And I was looking for a kind of founding myth that would give folks who are doing this a boost and to say, hey, this is actually not some new innovation. Maybe we shouldn't call it innovation. This is something that's been part of what we've been doing all along. And for me, the one that I came up with was the Northern Kingdom of Israel, right? That if we had more stories about the Northern Kingdom and how they weren't a bunch of evil-doing idol worshippers, but they were actually a more pluralistic, plugged into the world part of our heritage, then we could say, hey, we're actually building on their foundation and that is part of our mythology, and not only the mythology of the Southern Kingdom, which tends to be a more fundamentalist kind of mythology. And by the way, that was added to by my encounter with B'nai Lappi and her take on Talmud, which in many ways is inspired by your take on Talmud. So for me, that was very important. And as I listen to you talk about this, right, are we looking in some way for a mythos on which to understand what it means to be Jewish in the diaspora a century or so after the only really powerful mythos that has been around in the Jewish world has been the mythos of Zionism, which is about needing to have a state of our own, whether or not you subscribe to that, that has been the dominant mythos of the last century. And while even if you do subscribe to that, that might be wonderful in the sense that it's aligned with what you believe should be in the world, it doesn't really give you as a diaspora Jew much to build your own foundation on and your own life on. You're only kind of in the shadow of something else. And so is that kind of part of the agenda of what you're working on?
Well, it is. Yes, it's very much part of the agenda. You use the term mythos. I'm going to use what for some people will be a more neutral term, simply narrative, and insist. I mean, I don't have any hesitation to say this, that all peoples develop their narratives, and any group of people who are seeking to forge a common identity will together create a narrative that supports that identity. You're quite right about the mythos, the narrative of the last century. There is no doubt that the Zionist way of understanding Jewish history and understanding the place of Jews in exile in the context of that history has been the dominant way of thinking about this, the dominant way of telling the story. But it occurred to me when I was early in these explorations, the fact that I'm a Talmudist is not an accident here. After all, what it means to be a Talmudist is to, more than anything else, to study and teach the Talmud, which is the Talmud of Babylonia, this massive, creative, brilliant expression of a Jewish community in exile diaspora. Use the term that you prefer. If you recognize that Judaism as we know it is really the product of the Talmud. Rabbinic Judaism is the product of the Talmud, and Judaism for the last 2,000 years, right? That's exaggerating the number of years a little bit, right? But if we take the Talmud as such, but nearly 2,000 years is the Judaism that originates with these arguments, with these discussions in Babylonian academies. They understood that Jews needed to be able to live all over the world. They created a document that made it possible for Jews to live vibrant, engaged Jewish lives all over the world, whatever their immediate experience might be. So that I knew from the very beginning. What I didn't appreciate, certainly not fully, until I began exploring the texts that ultimately led to this book, is the fact that Jews, as a diaspora people, right? And it needs to be said that we became a diaspora people not 2,000 years ago, right? This is one of the mythical notions that we often hear repeated, this 2,000-year hope. We didn't become a diaspora or exilic people 2,000 years ago. We became an exilic people close to our origins as Jews, right? When we transitioned from being whatever ancient Israel was to Jews. The first exile, the Babylonian exile, right? I guess we could count the exile of the northern kingdom of Israel, but they didn't survive. So that doesn't quite figure into this.
Well,
But
arguably they did as refugees in Jerusalem. I mean, I think that's actually an
well,
interesting
yeah,
piece
well,
of it.
yeah, we could discuss that specific part of the history. That's right. I accept that for sure. I mean, Jews in significant numbers went to Babylon and elsewhere, and we have significant evidence of Jews living in diaspora communities throughout the period that Jews call the Second Temple period. Most historians of that period agree that from the Babylonian exile onward, there were at least as many Jews living in exile as there were in the land of Israel. And crucially, those exiles developed their own traditions. They had their own strengths. Even when Jews were in the land of Israel, if we look at both of the Talmuds, the Babylonian and the so-called Jerusalem, these communities shared teachings. They went back and forth. Exile didn't begin 2,000 years ago at the time of the Roman destruction of the temple, also because Rome did not have a policy of exile. They took prisoners of war, and in the case of the Judean wars, they probably took a lot, but that's not the same as exile. And the Jewish community in the land of Israel continued to be numerous and vibrant, mostly up north, Galilee, but along the coastal plain as well, for centuries after the destruction. So this oversimplification really does us a misservice when we think about the contours of Jewish history. We developed ideologies of diaspora. We developed justifications of diaspora. We understood our lives in diaspora to be meaningful in a wide variety of ways. And that's what this book seeks to uncover.
Yeah. I'm thinking of a couple strange things. One is, in my a cappella group in college, we had a song that ended on an unresolved chord, on a suspended chord.
Mm-hmm.
And the person who had arranged it that way. But we kind of had this debate, like, should we switch it so it ends on a resolved chord? That sort of, to most listeners, feels in their body like right, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Or should we leave it in this place that's kind of not most typical of unresolved? And I feel like that's kind of the maybe poetic way of distilling two different notions of Jewish history. Like, is this an unresolved chord? Is diaspora or exile, maybe for this side of the dichotomy, it would be exile. Mm-hmm. Is exile like an unresolved chord that desperately needs to be fixed, like be resolved? Or is the beauty in sort of the suspension, the not return, if that makes sense?
It is a kind of unresolved chord, but it doesn't desperately need to be resolved.
Yeah.
Okay, that's where we've got to make the distinction. It's unresolved because the hope that served as a kind of light of the future for Jews living in diaspora throughout the ages was that one day, right? But that day could be very, very, very far off. God would intervene in history again, bring a Messiah, and that Messiah would lead the people redeemed back to Zion. And I have to say here that one of the people who have studied diaspora recognize that part of the constitution of diaspora and a diaspora community is a dual orientation, right? You can be both at home, fully at home where you are, and nevertheless hope for some future return. So that's the second half of what you said that I reject, which is they desperately need to be resolved. No, not at all. On the contrary,
right?
We've lived in diaspora for many, many generations, sometimes free and creative, sometimes oppressed, right? All of those things are part of the experience that we've had. But the hope to return is a future hope. And this is what, listen, early Zionists understood this completely, right? Zionism is a radical movement. Right? Let's not make any mistakes about that. You can support that radicalism or not. Religious Jews, when Zionism developed, rejected it as being revolutionary. What was revolutionary about it was that it said we should take the redemption, right? The return, really, into our own hands, not wait for God, not wait for Messiah, and get that process going now and return. It was a secular movement, not a religious movement. And if you look at it from the religious perspective, beginning with teachings in the Talmud and those teachings then echoed in later rabbinic sources, Zionism would have been prohibited to a religious Jew, which is why religious Jews, when Zionism began, were so opposed to it, because the halakhic obligation was to wait for the Messiah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I love the way you're helping us think more complicatedly, more layeredly about Jewish relationships to home. I mean, I mentioned this to you before we started, and you can see me. Others, the folks listening can't. I wore a specific shirt for today's conversation. I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I'm also from Providence, Rhode Island. I live in Providence, Rhode Island. And I wore this shirt that is it's a map. It's not really a map, but it's the shape of Wisconsin, and it says home on it. I wore it because I've noticed in myself, and maybe this is a personality thing of mine, I don't think it's only me, but when I'm in Wisconsin, when I'm visiting my parents for, Passover, Thanksgiving, whatever, a lot of my conversations I have with people are about Rhode Island, because the thing that makes me interesting when I'm in Wisconsin is not that I'm from Wisconsin. Like that's everybody around. So I end up actually singing the praises of Providence. I call it Divine Providence. It's a whole shtick, whatever. But like I love this place, and it has become my home. I'm actually nearing the point in my life where I will have lived here as long as I lived in Milwaukee, which to me will actually be kind of a really fascinating moment. But then as I live here in Providence, all my friends know I'm from Milwaukee, and it's not like a sideline thing. I mean, I wear my Milwaukee Bucks stuff all the time. It's something that I have gained as a personality trait, that I'm a Wisconsinite. To all these New Englanders who don't know other Wisconsinites, I'm sort of their go-to. And I bring that up because I don't think I'm alone in that. I think that we could look at Jewish history and we could notice, the fact that Jews were in all these different places and were simultaneously anchored in those places, feeling connected to this group of people that was dispersed all around the world, that's part of what creates such an intense connection in people. I need my trips to Wisconsin to remind me how much I love Rhode Island, because when I'm here, I don't really think about it. And I think similarly, I actually need to be in spaces where Jews are a small minority in order to hold how cool this sort of historical experience is and the set of teachings we've gravitated towards, etc. Your book seems to suggest I'm not the first one to think that. Can you take us into the ways, starting with sort of a more ancient time period, in which people have actually seen living in diaspora or exile, etc., as a feature, not a bug?
Sure, I will do it chronologically, but I want to begin achronologically, because there is one example that many people will know that will help to illustrate precisely what you're saying. And that is the fact that it is correct when we speak about Jewish exiles to speak not just about Jewish exiles from the land of Israel, though that is certainly one of them, and it goes back to the very beginning. But Jews have been exiled from other homes where they've experienced those as genuine exiles, right? So the fact that Sephardi Jews are Sephardi Jews is a consequence of the fact that whatever the specific experiences were for the Jewish community living in what we call Spain, different parts of Spain, which of course was not united at the time, wherever they lived, in whatever century they lived, they were very much a part of this place, this culture, the local language, the local dress. And what I'm saying now is true of Jews in the vast majority of places. Jews spoke the local languages. The language of their neighbors was their language. The dress of their neighbors was their dress. This was true throughout Jewish history. And then when the Jewish home in Spain came to an end, 1492, and then just a few years later in Portugal, and the Sephardi community, the Spanish Jewish community, went elsewhere. They preserved their culture, their identity as Spanish Jews, their languages as Spanish Jews. All of that was who they were. And to this very day, that community orients itself not just toward the land of Israel, but toward its home that we call Spain. right? And that is instructive for this entire discussion. I think it reflects beautifully on what you said about your own experience, which is that while you may have an orientation as a Jew toward a once upon a time and future home, right? Now you have other homes and they are very much your homes. So let me go through a little bit of the history of that. To take just one example from the biblical text, and there are a variety of examples that I might, but uh, let's take the scroll of Esther, the Megillah, the book of Esther, which people might say, well, that's odd because isn't that a story about anti-Semitism and about Jews not being at home? But if you read it carefully, I believe it's fair to say that it's not that at all. And I'm certainly not alone among scholars studying the book who would say something like, if you look at the scroll of Esther describes Jews in the Persian Empire within just a couple of generations of having been exiled as completely at home there. Completely at home, right? First of all, the book embeds itself in Persian culture with Persian words, with the customs of the Persian court. It describes Jews as being dispersed throughout the entirety of the great ancient Persian Empire. Mordecai is described as being a courtier. Now, let's not make a mistake about this. Sitting at the gate of the king, which is the way the book repeatedly describes Mordecai and others, that's an official position. So within just a couple of generations, Mordecai has been appointed to one of the highest positions you could have in the Persian Empire, and he's got influence as part of that position. This story ends with Jews effectively being the rulers of the empire. And so that's part of the commentary as well, right? So let this all be a Jewish imagination, right? I'm not describing this as history, but it's historical in the sense that it reflects the sensibility of the Jew or Jews who wrote it, saying something about what it meant to live as a Jew in the Babylonian Persian world of antiquity. And they actually represent their fate, despite some danger, as being very, very positive, and Persia being very much at home. When we get to the Talmud, Babylon, so 4th, 5th, 6th century of the Common Era, in the legal discussions, not just in stories, but especially in legal discussions in the Talmud, the fact that Babylon is identified with the land of Israel. If you live in Babylon, it's as good as living in the land of Israel. They even suggest that the head of their community in Babylon, the exilarch, Resh Galuta in Aramaic, is superior as a descendant of the Jewish king to the leader of the Jewish community in the land of Israel. One of the most common themes, and this repeats itself in Jewish mysticism, the Zohar. We find a form of it in the Talmud. We find it later in European Hasidism. I mean, it's literally as ubiquitous as they come, is the notion that God follows Israel into their exile. Jews can never be in exile without God's presence being present. How could you be more at home than if you are in the presence of God? Isn't that, after all, what the land of Israel was supposed to be about? Well, if God follows Jews everywhere, then there is no place that Jews can be that is not home. The Maharal of Prague, the latter half of the 16th century, he's known best to some of your listeners as
Golem fella.
as the inventor of the golem, right? He
Yes.
wasn't known early on for that, but the fact that the legend came to be associated with him tells us
It's like
something
if you
about
were
his reputation.
Snoopy's dog owner or something. Like
That's
I
right.
feel like
That's right.
he becomes known for this mythical creature.
No,
Yeah.
no, it's true. Actually, well, it's actually interesting. Prague is an interesting city. You know, every city that tourists visit's got its tourist kitsch. So if you go to Paris, it's the Eiffel Tower. If you come to New York City, it's the Statue of Liberty. Might be some other things. If you go to Prague, I imagine it's the only city on earth where the tourist kitsch. There are two examples of it. Both of them are Jewish. One is the
Mhm.
Golem, and one is Kafka. It's a very, very interesting phenomenon. In any case, what the Maharal wrote was the natural place for Jews is the world as a whole, not any single particular home, but the whole world. And it's part of this developing narrative that justifies Jewish presence in whatever diaspora they find themselves.
Before we sort of explore, all the other parts in history, I wanted to go back to the most ancient particularly the stories that you talk about, the story of Joseph and the story of Esther. Just to note for our listeners, I mean, we've talked about this a lot on the podcast, but not everybody's listened to every episode. But just to make it clear to folks, we're operating on the assumption, which is the assumption that academia operates on, which is that the Torah was written by human beings, and it was written by human beings at different times. And when you really delve into it, most of those times were times when the Jews were living in diaspora.
Yes. The Torah itself is actually a crucially important document as a diaspora document. There's
Right,
something
which is shocking to a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, there's something deeply ironic about this because, of course, the Torah does offer the dream of passing over the Jordan River into the land, the covenant, the land of God's promise.
But it doesn't include it. It
But
doesn't actually
that's
feature
it.
that.
Exactly
Yeah.
right. The great Jewish 20th century Bible scholar Yechezkel Kaufman asked this question a long time ago, and it's a very insightful question. Why is it that the Torah ends with Moses and the people outside the land? And his answer, which I fully endorse, is that the Torah was actually the product of diaspora. The Torah as a document, this is according to biblical historians, did not exist till the Babylonian exile. It was produced by Jews in more or less the form that we know it in the Babylonian exile, and it is a document of exile. Even though it dreams of entering the land, its entire experience almost, right? Early stories that go through the land, but the Torah is about life outside of the land of Israel. And its practices, while it does imagine the building of a temple, are also many of them for life anywhere, either in the land or outside of the land. And the mere fact that Jews have the Torah, the Babylonian Jews created the Torah because they needed a sacred territory to rest on. And the Torah became their sacred territory, right? And Jews for all generations following could rely upon that same sacred territory while broadening it. The Torah is an example of the land of the diaspora. It can go anywhere.
So I want to test a notion with you, because when you start to think about the Torah, the Bible, having been written in diaspora, then I'm asking myself a theological question, which is that it's a pretty well accepted notion, and you talk about it in your book, that there was a theological innovation at the time of the Babylonian exile, which was we were exiled not because the Babylonians were stronger than us, but because God is our God, punished us for not doing what we were supposed to do. And so that is a way of keeping your religion or your people together in diaspora, because you say, oh, B'nai Lappi puts it this way. It's not that when your country is defeated, that means your God is defeated, which was the ancient conception. It was that we figured out a way to say, no, our God wasn't defeated. Our God did this to us because God wanted to punish us. And that is a theological innovation that kind of keeps you going. I'm wondering about a second theological innovation. And part of why I'm thinking about it is because as you write about the story of Joseph, which is written in exile and talks about in exile, what happens in the story of Joseph essentially is that because Joseph went a little too far, as Joseph often does, I mean, he did it with his brothers also in various ways, and because he went too far in trying to help the Pharaoh out with the famine, and he ended up essentially enslaving all of the Egyptians to the Pharaoh, they turned around and took it out on the Jews and said, we're going to enslave you. And similarly, in the book of Esther, the whole precipitating event that makes Haman want to kill all the Jews is that Mordecai won't bow down to him. And actually, there's no problem in bowing down to a king or a ruler. And so in that sense, it's also a story of our misfortune came upon us because of something that we did. And I'm wondering if that is also a kind of functional, I mean, it can be dysfunctional, but it can also be sort of a functional stance in diaspora, right? To say that we should be good citizens. You know, we should not try to, we shouldn't try to, it's not, I mean, you could put it in a bad way, like we shouldn't try to be too successful because then the non-Jews will be mad at us. But that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, like, we have to be good citizens of the societies in which we live, because the times when we've had misfortune has been partly our fault, which a lot of people don't like in both of those cases, right? A lot of people don't like the idea that mipnei chata'enu galinu me'artzenu, because of our sins we were exiled. I recently read an article by Barry Weiss where she's very upset about Jews blaming themselves for their misfortunes. And yet part of me thinks that's actually the theological innovation of Judaism.
Your last statement right now, I agree with, and I think it's a very, very important statement. Yes, one of the most important innovations of the biblical tradition, this is the prophetic tradition more than anything else, is that when something goes wrong, we ask ourselves, how did we contribute to this?
Right.
That is one of the great strengths of Judaism through the ages. And when people refuse, whatever they've experienced, to ask themselves, how did we contribute to this? They weakened themselves and their position. To be more specific about this, and I would frame this a little bit differently, the power of that notion, because of our sins, we were exiled, is not only theological, but psychological. And it's very, very deep, right? When human beings feel like they have no control, that they are subject to the whims and forces of an unthinking nature, that is petrifying, right? And it freezes you in place. If you have no control, then what the hell do? You try to protect yourself, but there's not a lot you can do beyond that. What the Babylonian exiles, or what the prophets anticipating the defeats that ultimately ended in the exile, their brilliance, what they realized was that by saying there is something in our conduct that led to this consequence, right? That means that our actions matter before God. And that's a very powerful position to be in, right? God cares enough about our actions to actually punish us. But what that simultaneously means is that if we take the actions, we call them tshuva, repentance, right? If we stop the things that we've done that aren't good, if we return to the things that we're supposed to be doing, the performance of the mitzvot, then we actually have the power to influence God in the other direction. That's a powerful position to hold, to say that what I do can actually bring God to me, or in effect, influence God to restore me to divine graces, to restore me to my former home, and so forth. And one of the ironies of all of this in the biblical period and beyond is that what this winds up meaning is that, at least in biblical times, the land of Israel is the land where Israel sins, and exile is the place where Israel atones. Another way of saying that is that the land of Israel is the place where Israel estranged God from Israel, and the diaspora is the place where Israel stood a chance of restoring that relationship. And that's actually the trajectory of the narrative that the biblical texts tell when we put them together.
That's a really cool frame. It's one of those where you hear it and you're like, of course. It's like I don't mean to diminish it, but I've never sort of put that together, that sort of by definition, exile, quote unquote, or diaspora in the story is where atonement is happening. That's super interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we think of exile as, and this is true, right? Exile as punishment. The Bible describes exile as punishment. But when we think of the word punishment, I think we probably think punishment is bad. What we fail to recognize is that in the same ideology, theology, actually punishment is good, because punishment is atoning, right? And atonement is what you need to restore your relationship with God.
Yeah, I mean, this is another attempt at allegory or metaphor. I'm thinking of the game hide and go seek. Like if everybody's too good at hide and go seek, it's not very fun, because if somebody hides and you immediately find them, like, part of the point of the game is having to seek, right? Like it's having to work. You could all like make an agreement beforehand. We're not going to hide in too hard of spots. We're going to save the time. But then the game is kind of meaningless. And I feel like that's similar to what we're talking about here. I mean, I'm thinking of one of my favorite sections of the Talmud, which is about taking a poop. It's about this section. I've quoted it a number of times on the podcast, so some people are rolling their eyes. Lex, you've got like two things you ever say. But there's this section of the Talmud where you hear about these rabbis who, I mean, they're not in bathrooms in the way we have with like,
right.
But they have like outhouses or whatever. Like they have a little toilet. And there's a question about on what axis, like in what direction should you orient your body when you're pooping? And they have this whole long exploration of that. And it's like, well, if you're here, like you shouldn't poop on a north-south axis, because then you're kind of pointing your butt at where the temple is. And like you should try to avoid, and like then this rabbi like plays a trick on his teacher, and he like switches the little indicator that reminds him which way to poop to see if his rabbi is paying attention. It's like a whole interesting thing. But I bring it up because you could say the point of that passage, because what it says is basically however you orient your body as you defecate, like you should try to have your mind on not doing so towards Jerusalem. Like you could say the point of that is to say how important Jerusalem is, right? Like that's one takeaway. The other takeaway is, wow, this is a diaspora document in the way you were describing, and the premise of it is that you are actually not in Jerusalem. Like this only serves a helpful purpose for people who are not in that place. Like this document only helps you if you are somewhere far away from Jerusalem, where you would have to then think about which direction your body is facing. And it's treating that as just sort of how the world is. It's taking that not as necessarily, well, you could argue this, but like on some level, it's treating that as the reality of the world and not something that, you know, we're going to change so that our bodies are not faced towards Jerusalem, they're in Jerusalem. And so this, again, I'm hammering home that this is ancient. Like we've received a story that diaspora, exile are bugs, not features. They're statuses of Jews or Israelites, etc., that need to be fixed. But I'm wondering, maybe you can take us a little forward in history. Are there other ways in which the point has more been about yearning, about having sort of aspirations for the future, for a better world, as opposed to like, oh, we're actually going to go to this particular location?
So, good question. I'm going to sort of cut it down the middle. Let me say something about the way I think this works. First of all, the bug feature question, right? Which leads to the next part of your question. There is no doubt that diaspora, exile, use the term that you like, is a feature of what it has meant to be Jewish and not a bug. It is fair to say, without any fear, that the vast majority of Jews in the vast majority of our generations have lived in exile. Right? There is no people who is exilic the way Jews have been. Part of that, though, what does it mean? It means we've got those multiple and many homes, but it also means that part of what keeps it together is not only our practices, the bulk of which can be practiced in our various diasporas, not only do those common practices, despite their variations, keep us together, but the hope of one day also, of course, keeps us together. The notion that there was a place where we originated as a people, where one day we hope to return as a people. Now, what is that one day hope? Does it mean literally to return to that land? Well, for some people, the answer would be yes. But what about the tradition that teaches? I mean, if you've got a lot of people coming back to life, remember that part of the final age is resurrection. Right. So if the final, if redemption is going to come with resurrection, we're going to need a lot of space. Right. A small territory isn't going to help very much. And so, of course, one teaching with many people know is that at the time of the Messiah or the time of the redemption, the land of Israel will expand. Well, if it expands, then where is the land of Israel? Right. If it's everywhere, then is it anywhere? Right. Do you have to go anywhere to get to the land of Israel, or does the land of Israel come to you? And this is one of the most fascinating themes that we see laid out, particularly in various Hasidic teachings, right, where the masters of various Hasidic communities insisted that Jews need not go to the land of Israel, right, because in fact, proper conduct in our homes, our present homes, let them be Ukraine, Polish lands, and so forth, Lithuania, wherever those lands are, we bring Zion to us. If we pray properly, we overcome exile. If we pray together, since exile means being dispersed, if we bring ourselves together in community, a minyan is a way to leave exile. I mean, all of these are teaching. So if the land comes to you, if leaving exile requires actually modest steps, then it's hard to know what that hope for a literal future return actually means. Having said that, when Jews said at the end of the Seder, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, which didn't mean L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. What it meant was, I hope the redemption comes soon. That's the next year in Jerusalem part. It didn't mean let's pack our bags, get up, and go to Jerusalem. That was
Which, just to
important.
clarify that, it's like if some baseball player who didn't get in the Hall of Fame was like next year in Cooperstown.
Right,
Like, they don't
exactly.
mean they'd
That's
like
a
to
good
make
way
a
to.
trip to Cooperstown. Cooperstown is where the Baseball Hall of Fame is. So if they're going there, they got in.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, that's a very good way to think about it. So, even the hope for a literal restoration to the land, but one that is delayed. I mean, the crucial part of this is that the way that Jews have thought about through the ages is, since it's divine intervention, it's unnatural. It's not a natural event returning to the land of Israel. It's a miraculous event returning to the land of Israel. And you see this repeated over and over again. Now, Zionists judged that, sorry, folks, the time has come. We've been waiting long enough. Our recent experience teaches us that we face many, many dangers. All of that was part of the story that they began to develop. The other part was, quite simply, we're actually modern people living as modern Europeans, and we want to do as modern Europeans do, which is to create a nation state, because that was the project in Europe in the 19th century. And so the combination of those considerations led to modern Zionism, which, said we've got to do something in the here and now. But that certainly wasn't tradition.
I wonder if we could go back in time to the Talmudic period, because I'm picking up on something that, you sort of said in passing a few minutes ago, which is 70 years after the Babylonian exile began, the Jews or the Judeans went back to the land. Oh, and by the way, not all of them went.
No,
And
some. That's what I said.
right,
Part
no,
of
no,
them.
no. And so I want to pick up on that because I think a lot of people don't think about that, right? I think a lot of people think about, like, yeah, then we went back to the land of Israel. We're there for another 500 years or whatever until the Romans destroyed the temple and then we were exiled again. But when we talk about the Talmudic period, I think we're talking about essentially two populations that are living in Babylonia in the, say, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries. We're talking about people that were the descendants of the people who had never left. So
Correct.
their family had been there for like 6, 7, 800 years. That is a long time.
That's right.
And then the other people were the people who had come relatively recently from the land of Israel because the Romans had done what they did, and some of those people, were exiled or exiled themselves to Babylonia. And so I'm wondering what we see in the Talmud, if we can sort of tease out the layers, in terms of, was there a debate between those two populations? Was there a sense that the people who had been there a long time thought that Babylonia was great, and the people who were of more recent vintage were sort of the ones driving the, Israel's better than Babylonia, or did it not kind of
No,
break down
no,
that way?
not at all. I mean, just to add one statement, I mean, you make reference to the longevity of Jewish experience in Babylon. Listen, the single longest home chronologically of Jews in this world has been Babylon, Iraq, right? Jews went to Iraq in the, 6th century BCE and never left until the 20th century. That was the longest lived Jewish home on earth. And people who are descendant from Jews of Babylon, Iraq, rightfully are very, very proud of that connection. I mean, you're right in identifying the two populations of Jews during the Talmudic period in Babylon, but it doesn't play out the way you just described. We know almost nothing about the non-rabbinic Jews because the only documentation we have that survives is rabbinic documentation, right? It's the rabbis are the ones who are telling us the story. So they reference Jews who do not accept certain rabbinic conventions or practices. For example, one of the issues they address legally is, what do we do with a Jew who doesn't accept the notion of an eruv, right? The combining of domains for purposes of carrying between one another on the Sabbath. What do we do with someone who doesn't accept that? Well, in my mind, that is unambiguously referring to a pre-rabbinic or non-rabbinic Jew, because the rabbis were the new guys on the block. What's interesting is that already in the early 3rd century, Babylonian rabbinic teachers. So the rabbinic movement originated in the land of Israel. Rabbis had come to Babylonia in the latter part of the 2nd century of the Common Era. And yet already the most prominent rabbinic teachers in the early part of the 3rd century, Rabbi Judah, Rabbi Yehuda, is what I would describe as the great Talmudic diasporist. He is the one who teaches that a Jew who lives in Babylon is not permitted to go to the land of Israel. He's the one who equates Babylon with the land of Israel and so forth. And so They develop the rabbis whose voices come to us through the Babylonian Talmud. They develop an orientation to Babylon that's very, very early and very, very strong. It doesn't hurt, right? And this goes back to the Torah. The Torah actually never claims that we have a natural connection to the land of Israel. On the contrary, we have a promised conditional connection to the land of Israel. But we didn't originate in the land, according to the Torah story. We originated in Babylon, right? We came to the land of Israel by divine command. And we didn't last there very long, at least not to begin with. And from the very beginning, our presence on the land was articulated as conditional. That covenant said, you are on this land which has been promised to you only so long as you follow the rules of the covenant. And if not, you're going elsewhere. When we went back to Babylon, ironically, we were going home. We were going back to the place where our parents were born. We were going back to the place where the prophet Jeremiah, speaking to the people at the time of the Babylonian invasion, said, that's where you're supposed to go now. And anyone who refuses to go, you are rebelling against God. Right? So the prophets who said, oh, no, don't go into exile, they were described by the prophets that we've accepted, right, as false prophets.
That's really interesting. I mean, it connects. I was brought to a story from the Torah. We're just throwing lots of biblical stories here that Dan and I have spoken about many times. And I bring it up because, I think it's deeply a story about tensions between diaspora, exile, and homeland. And because I think it reflects the ways in which we've received very specific ways of telling stories and not always thought through other sides of the story, which you've talked about that conception of Jewish history. I'm thinking of the 12 spies. I'm thinking of this moment in the wandering in the wilderness where, we call them spies. It's like an interesting term to use, but 12, scouts, spies, like designated people from each of the 12 tribes to go and, yes, scout out or spy out, do a sleuth mission, if we want to use the sexier term spies. They go to what is seen as potentially the promised land, Canaan. They look around and their job is to determine, should we enter this land? Now, that enter word is often used. It's basically, should we go to war with the people who live there to take it over and then live there? And the story, as I received it, and I think how most people receive it, is that, there's 10 people who say, we shouldn't go into this land. There's two, although in some parts of the story it's only one, but let's say two. Joshua and Caleb are two folks who say we should, and they're kind of the champions. They're the winners of this story because God is pleased about them and not pleased about the 10 other folks who are seen as sort of demonstrating a lack of trust that God would sort of successfully bring them into the land, that they'd successfully vanquish these opponents. They're seen as sort of not believing in God thoroughly enough because they think that they will be unable to surmount the obstacles in their way. It's interesting that I was never taught it as, here's a situation where 83%, 5/6, 10/12 of the Israelites, 10/12 of those people chose diaspora over homeland, in a sense. I mean, or at least...
Yeah, I got to tell you, I would not go there with that story, though there is a parallel story that I think makes your point.
So that's fair. I mean, basically, I don't know if this is the intention of the original story. I'm more saying that if you wanted to look at that story as a chance to talk out, what is it to live in a particular centralized land versus what is it to live wandering? Like, we're not given the positive side of the 10 folks argument. We're given what they're afraid of. We're not really given any sense that, they think, I'm droshing. I'm saying, like, what if they actually have a connection that many of us...
Well, you actually have that story, but it's in a parallel story. That story, I mean, all we have, as you just said it, is they were afraid. And I think it is a judgment of them for not having the faith, unlike Joshua and Caleb. They did not have the faith, and they are condemned for that fact. Right? Now, that plants a seed. The seed is that if you don't have the faith to go forward, if you discourage movement into the land, then that's something to be condemned, right? That's the way that story might well be taken. But there is a parallel story later on in the narrative where the tribes are, in Transjordan and setting up for the conquest. At first, two of the tribes, although in the end it winds up being two and a half of the tribes. So those were just the spies, 12 people. We don't know. Nobody took an opinion survey of the rest of Israel at the
Yes.
time of the 12 tribes. But what we do know is that the tribes, the leaders of the tribes, evidently with their approval, when they were in Transjordan and they were about to cross over, this doesn't happen till after the Torah is over, two of the tribes approached Moses and said, these lands over here, they're great for grazing, right? And
And
we
just
are,
for folks who want to Google this, it's Gad and Reuben, and it ends up being the half you're referencing is Manasseh.
it's
I
Menashe,
love the
right?
story. Keep going.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and we raise, flocks, and it would be great for us to make a home here, right? And if the meaning of the spy story had been, if you stay outside the land, you're to be condemned, and it's only good if you agree to go into the land, then there would have been one outcome of this later story of the tribes, right? You might have expected Moses to look at them and say, "What are you guys crazy? Didn't you learn anything?" But instead, what happens is Moses says to them, "Okay, right? As long as your men come in and help us fight the battle, you can make your homes here." In other words, Moses not only doesn't condemn them for expressing the desire to remain in a home that's outside the land, but quite comfortable, he actually supports them in doing so as long as they put their fate with the of the people as a whole. And what's interesting in the story as well is if you look at it, it's two of the tribes that approach Moses. And as you just said, in the end, it's two and a half tribes who wind up staying outside the land in Transjordan.
What's a few thousand people between
Yeah,
friends?
exactly. I
It's
mean, one of the
yeah,
commentaries
few
there
extra.
says, "Oh, yeah, there was a little bit of extra space. So Moses figured, let's not waste the space. Let's see who else might make a home there." But again, that's about making a home outside the land.
So I love titles of things. I am really interested in just how people choose to name that which they create. And we have a great opportunity through the title of your book, Embracing Exile. There's embracing. It's a different verb or gerund from like accepting exile,
Mm-hmm.
being okay with exile, getting through exile. Like it's embracing,
Mm-hmm.
not quite celebrating or like rejoicing, but it's embracing. And then there's exile, which I mean, look, you're actually part of a club, I guess, of folks recently using the word exile in books meant to push back on how people have framed exile. Shaul Magid has a book with that in the title as well. But I'd love to hear more about that, both on why embracing and why exile, but also because it didn't use the word diaspora, which is so pivotal to a lot of your writing, and also pivotal to many of our listeners and to many people playing around with terms like diasporism or diasporist. I guess I'm wondering both why you chose embracing exile and also why you didn't choose embracing diaspora. Like, what are some of the distinctions there? What do we mean when we say these terms, diaspora or exile?
So, I mean, to begin with, it does need to be said that the title sort of goes both ways because the main title is Embracing Exile, and the subtitle, which also appears centrally on the book's cover, is The Case for Jewish Diaspora. And there's some people who have seen the prominence of that as it's featured on the cover and said, "Oh, that's the name of the book." And that's fine. I mean, I can work it both ways. I wish I could take credit. The credit goes to the Oxford marketing department. But I do have to say, the moment I saw it, I embraced it. Right? I embraced the title they gave because I thought it was just so brilliant. Embracing an exile. Yes, I do want exile to be used in a less negative, at least neutral, and even positive way, right? Because exile is part of not only Jewish experience, but human experience. In the last chapter, I actually use Jews as the model of what refugees might be able to do in new homes, right? That's part of what it means to be a diaspora. But a diaspora's community is a particular kind of refugee community. I'll come back to that in a moment. The embracing is positive. When you embrace, you are making a positive statement. Obviously, it's not necessarily rejoicing, as you say, although there are times that Jews have rejoiced in their particular exiles. Embracing exile means to make it your home and recognize it as your home, right? And Jewish exiles have been our homes through the ages. Here, to speak positively about diaspora or exile, one of the things I speak about or report on in the chapter on modern commentary relating to diaspora is Gerson Cohn's brilliant essay, which I thought he mistitled. I understand. I mean, it was actually an address to graduating students from Hebrew College back in 1966, and he gave this talk and published it. He titled it "The Blessing of Assimilation," right? Which is fine, but what it really is the blessing of exile. And exile has been a true blessing. If we look at the variety of homes through the world and through the ages that Jews have lived in, where we have been occupied, every single one of them has enriched what it means to be Jewish. Whether it's the food or the artwork or the musical modes that inform prayer chanting. I mean, I could go on and on and on. The beauty of Judaism is precisely in its unity with its diversity. And the diversity is no less important than the unity part of it. Judaism would have been boring without diaspora, right? I mean, if we had lived in one place through the ages and only in one place through the ages, where would we have a shul that we don't go to, right? I mean, you need that shul. You need that synagogue that has a different custom from yours. And it actually creates excitement to know that that's yours, but it's different. Yes, this book title and this book does take its place by the side of some others that have recently been published. What I hope distinguishes this book is that it documents the full history, if not all of the specific examples, of what it has meant to live in and make a home of, and even to celebrate diaspora. And that part of our history, to come back to the beginning of our conversation, the narrative that's been told since the mid to late 19th century has not included that. It's omitted that part, right? Which is a very important part of Jewish experience. And my hope is that this book contributes to correcting that balance.
So I think in conclusion, the takeaway that I have for it, it's not that we need a counter-Zionist narrative. And that's not what this is, I don't think. It's that what has happened for the last 100 years is that a single narrative has come to predominate. It's almost like a monoculture, right? Mm-hmm. And a monoculture is not healthy, just like you've been saying about the boringness of if we didn't have the exile, right? There's a boringness of having a single narrative that everybody is supposed to accept. And even those who accept a narrative as an inspiring narrative, right? Meaning even if you are an ardent Zionist, I think it's also certainly okay, and I would say wonderful, to have another Jewish narrative that says Judaism can thrive and can be valuable and important in diaspora as well. And so for me, I see what you're doing here not as, but I'm curious if what you see, but not as offering an alternative, but is actually almost doing a tikkun, a repair of a situation where we are losing our alternatives, where we're losing our diversity.
Yeah, no, I think what you're saying, I agree wholeheartedly. My hope is that it's a tikkun, right? It brings back a part of our story that has been neglected. And by telling a fuller story, we have far richer resources to build on, right? The one thing that I absolutely reject, right? This is a personal position that is related to the book, but goes beyond it as well, is the position held by some, though certainly not all, Zionists, that looks for the negation of the diaspora. That's a well-known term, negation of the diaspora. And there were early Zionists and others who admitted to holding that position, and others today who enact that position without even recognizing it. And my response is no, the diaspora is crucial for Jewish life, for its past, for its present, and for its future. right? This makes no judgment about the importance of Israel, right? We may judge that Israel is also crucially important, but the crucial importance of one home doesn't negate the crucial importance of another home. And what I will say without any hesitation here is that Israel would not be as interesting as it is without Jewish diasporas, right? Think of the many Jewish communities in the land of Israel. Think of their different customs. Think of their different ways of thinking about Judaism. Those differences came to be in Jewish life and diaspora. Moreover, Jewish observance in the land of Israel would be poorer if not for the contribution of the diaspora. This I could document at great length, but an easy way to illustrate this is that the holiday we call Simchat Torah, Simchas Torah, the celebration of the beginning of, the ending and the beginning of the Torah reading cycle again, that is a diaspora day. It was invented to make something of the second day of Shmini Atzeret. Otherwise, they didn't know what to do with the second day of Shmini Atzeret, right? And in diaspora, you have
I don't know
2
what
days.
to do with the first day.
Right. Okay, there you go. Well, that's what's happened in Israel, ironically, right? That Shmini Atzeret has become Simchas Torah. There's almost no Shmini Atzeret anymore. But my point is that the richness of Jewish observance, it is impossible to exaggerate the enrichment of Jewish life and culture and religion, and that is a product of the diaspora. And if we seek to negate that, we only impoverish ourselves wherever we as Jews live.
Thank you so much, David Kraemer, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
My pleasure.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. A quick little shout before we fully close things. We have a Discord server. It's not fully new, but it is recently open to the full public, and we hope that you will join it. You can head to discord.judaismunbound.com to do so. We've got so many channels with conversations about the Jewish future, about our podcasts, about just sharing pictures of your pets, all sorts of good jazzy things in our Discord. Go ahead and join discord.judaismunbound.com to make the experience of this podcast not just a receiving mode where we're talking and you're hearing, but rather one where you get to contribute actively to the conversation. It's been a wild ride watching this grow to the point where we're now nearing a couple hundred folks participating pretty actively on a day-by-day basis. It is a great place to be. discord.judaismunbound.com. Now we will close things out with a reminder that we're deeply appreciative always when you are interested in being in touch with us. Discord is, of course, part of that, but you can also send us notes in any of the following ways. First, there's our Facebook and Instagram handles. Both of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, there's our website, judaismunbound.com, where you can find show notes for this episode and all sorts of other juicy goodies. And you can email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. We're also deeply grateful if you are interested in making a donation to support our work. You can do so on either a monthly recurring basis or via a one-time gift by heading to judaismunbound.com/donate. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.